Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to session 3. My name is Kang I am law professor at Seoul Metropolitan University. The theme of the session 3 is sustainable earth governance and corporate roles in climate change. As you might know, in relations to corporate roles, there are many new roles required to businesses, responsibility, and ESG. These are the new terms which have emerged as buzzwords. And in the second session, we talked about ESG, the roles and the responsibility of businesses in general. So in session 3, that we're going to talk about sustainable earth governance and corporate roles in climate change. In relation to this theme, that we are privileged to have 3 speakers. We have changed our order a little bit due to our schedule. So the first speaker is Mr. Park Siwon, Professor Park Siwon. He is a law professor at Kangwon University. And the second speaker is Mr. Peter Burdon, professor of law at University of Adelaide. And lastly, that we are going to have founder and CEO at Nature's Rights, Momta Ito. So the founder and CEO of Nature's Rights, Momta Ito, will close the session with the last speech. So before we begin, we'd like to introduce these 3 speakers. So Professor Park, law professor at Kangwon University. He is teaching environmental law, and also he is engaging in various activities at People for Earth. So he is an expert in environmental law. And the second speaker, we are privileged to have Professor Peter Burdon. He is in the southern part of Australia, which is Adelaide, and he is representing University of Adelaide. He is the law professor. He has written environmental-related books and has actively engaged in activism. Last but not least, we will have Momta Ito, the founder and CEO of Nature's Rights. She has a very unique experience. She worked as a finance lawyer in London, and she moved to the public sector to work as a lawyer in environmental sector. And she has actively engaged in efforts in protecting the nature. So she is living in the Scottish Highland, and she is enjoying ecological life. So I'm curious about her lifestyle. So as I mentioned, I'd like to welcome Professor Park Siwon as our first speaker.
I am Park Siwon, who is teaching at the Kangwon University. Climate Change and Climate Change Act and Environment Act is something that I'm majoring in and teaching. And I've been invited to this forum, and it is a great opportunity. So it is a great pleasure for me to be invited to this new place. Today, I'm going to tell you about the corporate climate responsibility in the era of ESG. We heard about the RE100 and responsibility about companies. I was able to watch this session, the previous session, so I'm going to watch the previous session. Today, we are talking about the sustainability of the Earth. Of course, there are many stakeholders engaged. Then who are the key players? I personally believe it can be companies. In the past, there was Lots of efforts made by the government to reduce greenhouse gas. However, in the future, the company's responsibilities and their actions will be more vividly discussed as time goes by. So, this is the agenda for today. I'm going to tell you about the litigations about climate change. And there are various types of the litigations related to climate change. And the second topic is there are climate change related litigations against the companies and what are the implications to Korean companies. Before talking about climate change, and as you know, climate change is not an area that a single country can do. So you probably heard about the concept about the climate change. Under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there has been discussion and negotiation for the last 30 years. Around 195 countries should compromise each other. So the issue has become more complex, and the conflict of interest has become more complex. So the speed and the progress is slower than expected. Actually, it is too slow. However, after the 1992 and now in 2015 Paris Agreement, many countries made an agreement. The number of the countries joining in this process has increased. And there are better monitoring mechanisms for the activities of many countries. However, still, we are in a daunting situation. As you can see, under the UNFCCC IPCC, there are regular reports coming in. According to assessment report, which are released in every 5 to 6 years, according to AR4, to curb the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius level by 2020, advanced countries should work really, really hard. That was the agenda. In the AR5 in 2013, many countries are working, however, we cannot meet the 2 degrees Celsius scenario. We cannot do it. We should be more aggressive. That is the conclusion of the AR5. To prevent catastrophic changes, by 2100, zero emission should be accomplished. And with this speed, we are going to running out of the carbon budget. However, the reality about climate change is getting only worse. People are not listening to the scientists of IPCC. In 2018, when you take a look at the special report, the best scenario can be 1.5 degrees Celsius rather than 2.0 degrees Celsius. To do that, we should do something more. Actually, the target time frame was 2100, but now the time frame has become reduced to 2050. Net zero should be accomplished by 2050. In the AR6, by 2030, we should emit only the half of the greenhouse gas compared to now. Within 8 years, we have to cut down the greenhouse gas emission by half to meet the 1.5 degree scenario. Actually, it's pretty much impossible. That's very, very ambitious. For example, you need to spend only 50% of the energy compared to what you are using. You have to look at your cell phone 50% less. You have to watch YouTube 50% less. You have to drive your car 50% less. So 50% less is pretty much aggressive, as you know. And we are living in that kind of era. then what matters is the progress is too slow, way too slow. So we cannot simply rely on president or the economic leaders. That's why citizens wanted to utilize the jurisdiction or the judicial branches. They are making petition and they are starting the litigation. The first climate litigation was starting from the Los Angeles, which was made in 1990s. For the last 30 to 40 years, there were many litigations related to climate change. And there were more than 1,500 cases, and we can make a pattern out of that. And there are four types of the patterns: the litigation against the government, the second one is the climate liability against the companies, the third one is the litigation against the companies, accusing that the company did not disclose the information, or sometimes they distribute the false information. There are sometimes criminal cases. In Korea, there are many human rights cases. The climate change is closely related to human rights, so people refer to constitutional complaint or the constitutional petition. Of course, scholars have a different classification, but I can say there are four categories about the litigations. What matters is the standing issue, whether the petition is legitimate or not, whether I am the right person to fight against the government. That is the standing issue we talk about. In many cases, the standing issue has been rejected in many of the cases. If you are legitimate person who can make the litigation, there should be damage directed to you, and your damage should be recovered. And that's really difficult to prove each and one all of those requirements. And as you know, there are some discretionary power from the administrative branch. In that case, there can be only limited intervention from the judicial branch. And the typical case is Massachusetts against the EPA. Many people thought that this cannot be won, but on the Supreme Court, this case was won, and this is a milestone case. Regarding this litigation, there was a book published. Dr. Kim Seung-jin translated this book. The book is really interesting. Anyway, the Massachusetts government was losing its territory, and the court said there can be regulation for the emission coming from the cars. And the court found out the emission from the cars can have a significant impact on climate change. Of course, regulating the emission gas cannot be the solution for climate change, but at least it can be a mitigation measure. So this is a milestone case. And actually, when you are fighting against the company, it can be more difficult rather than fighting against the government. In the past, there can be litigations against the companies, and almost all cases, people lost. This is a native village of the Kivalina against the ExxonMobil. And there is a small town, and there were around 200 families living in that island. However, there was a rise in sea level. They have to migrate. They want to get some compensation about their migration. They did nothing wrong. So they are living in Alaska. They want to keep their culture, and they don't want to leave their hometown. So they were asking for a compensation to the oil and gas company. Alaska is located far on the northern side of the US, as you can see on the map. And this In this case, the people lost because the court said it is really difficult to find out the causal effect. The greenhouse gas can eventually have impact on the sea level rise, but there is no direct causal relations between the two. So in the civil case, defining a causal impact should be very accurate and direct. There are many oil and gas companies. There are many oil and gas companies. So this oil company is not directly responsible for the rise of the sea level. In Louisiana, many people suffered from hurricane. The plaintiff was arguing that the defendant made significant greenhouse gas emission, and Hurricane Katrina has become larger because of the greenhouse gas emission. They lost their houses, they lost their cars, and we had a similar case in Korea, and many people suffered because of the huge typhoon. And there were not that many news that was covering that the climate change caused a bigger typhoon. You can see the photo of Katrina. The New Orleans were almost drowned, and 92% of the citizens had to evacuate from the city. There was significant damage in terms of the life and properties. However, the court was ruling that there was no causal relations between the two, so the plaintiff lost. What judges are saying, do not bring this to the court. This one needs a political solution. There should be a new regulation or the new act. We do not have a regulation or the act, so we cannot make a judgment. That's what the court was saying at the time. The third one is the fraud claim against the company, against the ExxonMobil. And the plaintiff argued that they are not explaining about the consequences and they were violating the consumer law. They funded a scientist to tell the wrong information. And climate change is taking place not because of the CO2 that has been emitted by mankind. So, the plaintiff argued that this is the fraud claim. And there was a cigarette claim. And some people argued that they got the cancer because of this cigarette, but they were lost in the initial case. However, in the second case, they won because the cigarette company distorted the information about health. So there was a huge the huge penalty against the cigarette companies. I've been telling you about classical cases, which were the litigation before 2010. And after 2010, things changed. There are two characteristics. The first one is related to human rights. The second one is there are new arguments against the corporations. Today, I'm going to focus on this one. The first one is the Dutch case. Probably this has been covered by People for Earth. The NGO was asking for more ambitious greenhouse gas reduction against the Dutch government. They won in the first and the second trial. This is unprecedented. In the Uruhanda litigation, the key is the Netherlands has the midterm greenhouse gas reduction target, but the reduction target is relatively lower compared to other European countries. What matters is the country is in violation of the duty of the care. In the Netherlands, the NGO lawyers references the constitution and their civil law quoting the state government has duty of the care. And in the European Union Charter of the Fundamental Rights, there are rights to life. And the government should protect the the life of the citizens against the significant climate damages. The second case, of course, this is a human rights litigation, which took place in the US. This one took place in parallel with the Uruhenda litigation, and they were giving positive feedback to each other. The plaintiff was the youth, and the defendant was the US federal government and fossil fuel companies. The youth argued that the federal government were aware of the fact that the climate change can be disastrous, but they did not restricted fossil fuel. Rather, they encouraged it or they subsidized the usage of the fossil fuel. That is the argument from the plaintiff. Within the Fifth Amendment, the life property rights should be protected. However, there was a violation, and too much burden is given to the future generation. That is in violation of the rights to equality. And in the US, there is no environmental rights, but they have quoted the public trust resources. And they argue that the state government was in violation of its duty to protect public trust resources. The students made their stories, as you can see, and they were complaining. For example, the ski player cannot practice anymore because it is not snowing anymore. In the first trial, the court recognized that there is an injury, in fact, to many of the individuals. There are typhoons and there is a sea level rise that can have a significant impact on the life of the youth. And for the younger generation who are going to live in the future, there will be significant impact on that. So it is going against the rights to equality. So there was a request for the rejection. However, anyway, this case was stopped because the upper court raised a hand for the defendant. These two cases had a significant impact across the world. After the 2010, the trend of the litigation has changed. In Germany, the plaintiff won the case. The youth was raising a litigation. The reduction target is too low. It is a violation of our basic human rights. There is a reduction target by 2030, but the government does not have the specific goals, and the target for 2030 is too low. 55% of the reduction is too low. That's the argument from the plaintiff. By 2020, Germany already achieved the 40% milestone, and reducing only 15%, well, that can be like delivering the burden to the future generation, too much burden for the next generation. That was accepted by the court. And as you know, Korea and Germany have a constitutional court, and there are not that many countries which have the constitutional courts. And many of the Korean scholars who study laws studied in Germany, and especially we have been significantly influenced by the German Constitutional Court. So there was a ruling from the German Constitutional Court, and this can have a significant influence on South Korea. After the ruling, the German government raised its greenhouse gas reduction target from 55% to 65%. And they have the interim target in 2040, 88%. And they are going to have the carbon neutrality in 2045, 5 years. earlier than the original plan. The German government made the decision that they are going to make more efforts. And there were no one who won against the company. When you are asking for the compensation on the civil cases, there was no one who got compensated. In the Netherlands, there was a milestone ruling. The Royal Dutch Shell is the largest oil company within the Netherlands. The NGO fought against the Royal Dutch Shell, and they complained the company does not have any greenhouse gas reduction goal internally. And you are emitting significant gas, and how can you do not have any target or the plan for 2030 or 2050? And you are in violation of your obligation. In the first trial, the Royal Dutch Shell should follow the OECD guideline, which is a soft law, and also they have to follow the UNGPs. Based on this, the Royal Dutch Shell has the reduction target, and they have to reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 45% by 2030. This is the last case. The Peru farmers sued against the RWE. This is a power supplier. And there is a glacial lake, and that was flooded. However, the melting speed was too fast, so there were many floods. So it can be damaging the property rights of the farmers. The farmers were suffering so much. And Peru is not a rich country, and they want to complain someone. Many of the advanced countries' gas and oil companies emitted greenhouse gas. It is not us who should block the damage coming from the flood. In the first trial, they lost. There was no causal relations. In the second trial, many people said, oh, it makes sense. And RWE is accounting for 0.5% of the global emission. So RWE have to account for 0.5% of the total cost. And there should be an evidence finding and feasibility test. The German judge traveled to Peru and they made some investigation. This is the first case against the large international corporation, and they were asking for financial compensation. And probably there can be financial compensation paid from RWE. But there are many companies. And what is the implication to those companies? On the same logic, and probably they can be sued in other countries outside of Korea. In the past, the plaintiff lost against the companies. In every cases, the key is the causal relations. Now we have a better methodology to find out the causal effect between the two. Between the 2013 and 2014, there was a significant heat wave in Argentina. And it was possible to find out that the heat wave is 5 times more likely because of the greenhouse gas emission. They can find out that kind of the causal relations. The EU emission is accounting for 37% of the cause for the heat wave. Now you can pinpoint which country is more responsible for this kind of weather event. Just like in the case of the 2018 Northern European heat wave, Climate change made the heat wave 2 to 5 times more likely. And now people have a better methodology to calculate the total emission, accumulated emission, and also they have the better statistical model to find out the causal effect between the two. A single country, a single company can become accountable for this kind of the emission. Once UNFCCC was created in 1990s, there was a clause, loss and damage. You probably heard about the countries like Maldives or the least privileged countries in Africa. They are likely to suffer more, and they cannot take up all the recovery cost. That's why the loss and damage was on the table. The advanced countries did not accept loss and damage, and they fought against it for the last 20 years. In the Paris Agreement, the agreement was the loss and the damage can be covered by the advanced countries, but that does not mean that advanced countries will give some financial compensation. In the Paris Agreement, the advanced countries won when it comes to loss and damage. However, as I told you, we have a better methodology. A single person can sue against a company or against a state. So the loss and damage can be brought back to each individual. An implication to Korea will be covered during the Q&A. Is a matter of the basic human rights and environmental rights. In which year were you born? Those who were born in the 1960s, they emitted the most greenhouse gases. And as time goes by, those who were born in 2010, compared to those who were born in 1960, they can use carbon only 1 in 6. So it's a typical definition of inequality. So that's why people say the climate change is a matter of the human rights. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Park. Professor Park gave us many case studies, especially about many of the litigation studies. She talked about the trends across the world. Thank you very much for sharing the useful information. As Professor Park said, there can be social responsibilities. So social pressure is not good enough. So the judicial branch is now in action. In the US and in the Netherlands, many of the advanced countries are now making litigations against the government, against the corporations. And there were many winning cases against the government, and even an individual can sue against a corporation or a state based on very accurate and sophisticated simulation methodologies. They can sue, individual can sue against the company or a state. It is highly likely that they can get some financial compensation eventually. Thank you.
Now I'd like to move on to the next speaker. As I mentioned earlier, that we are honored to have Professor Peter Burdon. He is from the University of Adelaide. I think Professor is now joining us online.
Okay, so it's okay. I'll just begin then. Again, thank you very much for inviting me to be a speaker here. It's a great honor and privilege. As was mentioned in the beginning, I'm coming from Southern Australia, which is the very bottom middle of Australia. And you may or may not know that in Australia, there are over 350 different groups of Aboriginal people. And so the land that I'm coming to you from is called the Kaurna or Kaurna country. So I pay my respects to the Kaurna people. My talk is going to be on the idea of responsibility. And my interest in the idea of responsibility emerges in the context of the Anthropocene. As some of you will know, the Anthropocene is a proposed name for a geological epoch which recognizes the power of a very small group of humans who have caused a rupture to the Earth system. So it's in that context of a rupture to the Earth system that my thinking is coming from. It's slightly bigger than like an ecological impact or a single issue such as climate change. Now, I mentioned before that the Anthropocene is this time where humans have this immense power, the power to alter the Earth system. A focus on human power has captured many responses. At its worst, it's led to very hubristic or arrogant statements about our power, such as what you would find in the eco-modernist manifesto. But there's another side to this. As human power has increased, so too has the power in the Earth system. And taken together, we have more power at work on Earth, and human beings do not wield the monopoly. We're grappling and stumbling for the right language to describe this state. Some authors have returned to the idea of Gaia, while others argue that the Earth has awakened and now seeks her revenge. Within this chorus, other voices are noting that the Earth has always had its own agency. And in terms of our work, we might regard this as the central fact of the Ecozoic. Mary Evelyn Tucker, who spoke this morning, mentioned or spoke about Thomas Berry. And I think this idea is very neatly captured in his statement that the universe is composed of subjects to be communed with, not objects to be used. So what Thomas Berry was really picking up on was this idea that humans are not only interconnected to the environment, but that the environment has its own agency and subjectivity as well. So as humans, we find ourselves today in a world which is increasingly heteronumerous and where we no longer have the monopoly of agency. My own attempt to grapple with this has led to a focus on stories. So stories that exhibit something of the will beyond human beings. These are not very hard to find, but because of the international nature of this conference, I will just quickly talk about a story which I hope we all know. It's The Sorcerer's Apprentice by the great German writer Goethe. And I'm not the first to draw the analogy between The Sorcerer's Apprentice and the Anthropocene. And I just acknowledge the work of people like Clive Hamilton and my friend Ron Angle, who have spoken about this. So in the poem, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, there is a powerful sorcerer. And the sorcerer departs their sanctuary and leaves their apprentice to study. Now, as soon as they're alone, the apprentice is filled with youthful conviction, filled with the idea that they have great power and can master the elements. The apprentice is impatient to feel the power, and they also believe that they have the power to control their master's magic. So this is what Goethe says: I am now master, I am tactician, all his ghosts must do my bidding, know his incantation, spell and gestures too. By my mind's creation, wonders shall I do. Now, if you've seen the 1940 Disney adaptation of this poem, you'll be very familiar with what happens next. The apprentice commands a broom and a basin of water to perform his chores. But just like human beings, the apprentice was unable to control the power he had unleashed. How did the apprentice react? Not with humility and grace, but anger and a renewed attempt to assert his dominance. So again, Goethe says, "No, no longer shall I suffer, you too, bold defiance. I have brains, I am the stronger, and I shall enforce compliance." I won't tell the rest of the story, but of course, this pattern continues, and as things spiral out of control, the apprentice becomes increasingly desperate. Humility is beyond him, and when magic fails, the apprentice resorts to brute force. He picks up an axe and chops the broom in two. But like the Hydra in Greek mythology, the broom does not break. It multiplies and continues to sweep. And at risk of overdoing my simile to the environmental crisis, the broom has its own agency, an agency that the apprentice has no hope of controlling. Now, many of these old stories have a similar ending. Usually what happens is a higher power enters and saves the day. And that's exactly what happens here. In Goethe's story, the sorcerer returns home and restores order with the slightest of gesture. I think the reception of this story is instructive. It was told during a period of folk tradition when people believed in powers beyond the human. And while it can be read as a religious story, the idea that salvation comes through a higher power, it's more properly understood as pre-ethical in the sense that the message derives from a world where the apprentice is not a moral agent, but someone who aspires to go beyond all moral laws. The intention of the story, of course, is to present a warning against those who seek to rise above the proper bounds of human agency. And in the last 3 centuries, a minority of humans have used techno-industrial power to delude themselves into thinking that they've graduated from apprentice to sorcerer. In so doing, they've endangered the majority of the world. Now, in thinking about these stories, I wonder what kind of legal and ethical response is adequate to the violence of the Anthropocene? How do we respond, in other words, to the fact that a small group of humans have caused a rupture to the Earth system? Clive Hamilton, the Australian philosopher, says that if human impact has been so powerful that it's deflected the Earth from its natural geological path, describing this state of affairs as unethical or unlawful seems to be a kind of category error. And certainly traditional ethics risk trivializing the magnitude of what has been done or normalizing an event that is without parallel. No idea of utilitarianism was designed to confront this, nor was a Kantian golden rule. We are living in a period that Alex Steffen has called discontinuity, a moment where the experience and expertise you've built up over time cease to work. This is not just an intellectual understanding, but it's emotional as well. There's the shock that comes with recognizing that you are unprepared for what has already happened. I find myself reeling from this shock and can only offer inadequate reflections on a way forward. But I think our work begins by sitting with the fact that there is a duality, an increase of power from a small minority of humans, and at the same time, more power and agency at work in the Earth system. This is a responsibility that we have now, and it can't be discharged by pretending we don't or withdrawing and expecting the environment to return to some kind of natural state. Not only is that impossible, I don't regard it as desirable. We now have a responsibility for the Earth system, and pretending otherwise is deeply irresponsible. We also cannot discharge our duty through neoliberal attempts to personalize responsibility. By that, I just mean the idea that if you just change your light bulbs or your consumption patterns will be okay. We can't discharge it through individual acts, nor should we try to share it out equally amongst humankind and pretend that we're all equally responsible. As other speakers have already pointed out, we're not, and there are some who bear the burden of greater responsibility. And I think it's better that our ethical anger and proposals for reform be directed at the 100 or so companies who are responsible for climate change and the Anthropocene. And here I think this underscores the importance of Professor Park's comments, which are, as she mentioned, individuals now have the capacity to bring litigation against individual companies. So for me, in thinking about responsibility in the Anthropocene, I think it means that we need to situate human freedom, not in relation to other humans, but as emerging from nature as a whole. And again, this is a very common idea in Ecozoic scholarship. It's also a pre-ethical position in the sense that I discussed Goethe's poem. In law, it's also something that I think is better dealt with using the language of obligations and responsibilities rather than rights. While there's no need to cast obligations in opposition to rights, I feel some compulsion to do so because of the way rights have come to dominate approaches to environmental protection and crowd out alternative justice claims. Following Susan Marks, I've also become increasingly concerned by the way rights are marked by their history as a liberal concept and the way they can be manipulated to serve capital accumulation or business as usual. I won't say more about this now, but I think that rights enable us to externalize a problem and project Western legal concepts onto nature. But the problem is not out there. The problem, as other speakers have said, is with a privileged minority who act with wanton neglect and self-indulgent gluttony. If embeddedness in nature provides a reason for responsibility, what is our motivation? Why should we be motivated to act with responsibility? Some writers claim that we have none. We have no motivation. Clive Hamilton, for example, argues that for all of its worthiness, appeals to responsibility have no heft, no ontological substance. I have some sympathy with this conclusion, particularly as someone who has observed multiple COPs and watched them fail in their ambition and participated in environmental activism for decades. But it also feels like a conclusion drawn out of despair, or a conclusion that assumes that ethical motivations require a higher being to love or to fear. Clearly, a new ethics cannot be conjured from mid-air. It awaits realization and articulation by humans who are fully inhabiting the new epoch. So while not adequate, I suggest that we might take are first tentative steps in conversation with scholars such as Simone Weil and Hans Jonas. Let me begin with Simone Weil. Weil, as you may know, was a French philosopher and political activist. Toward the end of her life, she died in 1943, Weil turned her attention to obligations, which she argued come before that of a right, which is relative and subordinate to it. In what sense might we regard obligations as prior to rights? Weil answered by noting that a right is not effectual by itself. Rights, in other words, presume the existence of an obligation to which it corresponds. Weil's primary concern as a writer is to try to shift our attention from the personal, the individual, to the impersonal. Weil uses the term impersonal to describe those needs which are most essential to the lives of humans. She listed some in her draft statement on human obligations. The list of essential impersonal needs include basics like food, clothing, access to medicine and housing, as well as protections from violence. And I think you can see some relationship between these impersonal needs and what's contained in the ESGs. Now, Weil was not writing in the context of the environment, but it's not difficult to apply her thinking for this purpose. Take, for example, my own country in Australia. Take one of the numerous proposals to expand coal mining or gas projects. It's common in Australia for environmental campaigners to respond in the language of rights. So a campaigner might say that the government doesn't have the right to approve such a proposal, or that the environment has a right to regenerate and flourish. For Weil, this is an individualistic approach that relies on adversarialism and reduces complex problems to matters of property. What happens, though, if we frame the same issue in the language of obligations? Here we might instead argue that it is unjust for the government to grant a license for fossil fuel extraction, because such an act will punish the physical and mental well-being of the Earth community, current and future. And here I can't help but to reflect on Professor Park's comments, and the success of so much of this climate litigation has relied on tortious or tort law and ideas of obligation or duties. Interestingly, though, in Australia, one of the only cases of this kind failed when a court of appeal held that the Minister for the Environment did not have a duty to protect future generations, which was obviously a disappointing blow in climate litigation here. But if I can just return again briefly to Simone Weil, she would argue that the language of rights ignites the spirit of contention, while if we tried to frame and think about this problem in terms of obligation, we might touch and awaken at its source the spirit of attention. This is because the language of obligations is connected with empathy, an attempt to attend to the lives of others, including the non-human world. And Weil comments on this, and you can see her quote on the slide. She says, anyone whose attention and love are really directed towards the reality outside the world recognizes at the same time that he is bound both in public and private life by the single and permanent obligation to remedy, according to his responsibilities and to the extent of his power, all of the privations of the soul and body which are liable to destroy or damage the earthly life of any human being whatsoever. Now, just briefly, Hans Jonas came to responsibility for a different set of reasons. His key book is called The Imperative of Responsibility, and it was written just at the dawn of the Anthropocene, what Earth system scientists refer to as the Great Acceleration. The book is also marked by Jonas's experience during the Second World War. Jonas was an active member of the Jewish Brigade of the British Army, and he saw active combat. In reflecting on what he saw during the war, Jonas described the apocalyptic state of things, the threatening collapse of the world, and the climactic crisis of civilization. And I think it feels impossible that a person could experience what Jonas experienced, the death camps, the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. It's impossible that someone could experience those things and not reach that conclusion. Jonas argued that the qualitatively novel nature of certain of our actions has opened up a whole new dimension of ethical relevance for which there was no precedent in the standards and canons of traditional ethics. Rather than advancing a theory of rights, Jonas worked against the grain and focused on proposals that restricted human action. In his words, the lengthening reach of our deeds pushed obligations into the center of the ethical stage. Sadly for us, Jonas did not have a neat trick for motivating this sense of responsibility. Instead, he noted that people's hearts and minds must be engaged. He argued, for that rejoinder to reach and affect me so that it can move the will, I must be receptive for appeals for this kind. Our emotions, our emotional side must come into play. And it is indeed of the essence of our moral nature that the appeal, as insight transmits it, finds an answer in our feeling. It is the feeling of responsibility. Now, in part, this is why I'm interested in stories, like the one which I used to begin this presentation, because stories tap in to an emotional center that logic and facts can miss. To borrow from David Hume, the British philosopher, reason is the slave of the passions. So our passions have to be motivated. So to conclude, I don't want to hold out old thinkers like Simone Weil and Hans Jonas as a quick fix for our problems. There are clear limits to their writing and ideas within them that we would jettison. But I think we could do worse than enter into conversation with thinkers who had a front row seat into the heart of evil in the 20th century and responded with compassion and a sense that we could do better than our past suggested. That's exactly the sort of mindset we need when we're thinking about the future of environmental law and ideas of responsibility. Thank you so kindly for your attention. I've appreciated the opportunity.
Thank you for your presentations. And please, Professor Burdon, please stay on the line. The debate will be soon. 네, 잠시 후에 토론이 진행될 예정이고요.
There will be a debate in the meantime. Professor Peter Burdon, thank you very much for the presentation. Let me summarize the contents of the Peter Burdon's presentation.
So he talked about the responsibility in Anthropocene. So not only the law, but also psychology And then in many parts, he is embracing the many disciplines to apply various ideas into his studies. So yeah, his presentation was amazing. He not only touched upon the legal part, but he had such insightful presentation encompassing various parts. And especially it was remarkable to note that we tend to think that the rights and obligations are two sides of the coins. However, the obligation side and the rights are compared on the same note. However, Professor Burdon mentioned that from the perspective of the responsibility in dealing with climate change, that we have focused on too much on rights. In terms of rights and obligations, that there should be two sides equally. However, we focus too much on rights. That's why rights can be exaggerated in terms of intention, and rights can speak different notes. That's why we need moral and ethical perspectives to deal with climate issues, climate change issues. So that was a very fresh perspective. Also, he referred to Simon's file and the interesting opinions and stories were shared in asserting his arguments. And it was interesting to see the sources. The slide was very interesting. So the sorcerer's apprentice was willing to use power. However, he failed to control his power. And so without solving the issues, so he had to rely on the high power. So by using that analogy, that we were able to look back ourselves. So we were compared to the apprentice. So the slide was very intuitive, and we were able to see the analogy between human and also the apprentice. So since we are ready, we're going to move on to the discussion.
토론에 앞서서 원래 공지되었던
And before starting the discussion, let me give you an announcement. CEO and the founder Ito was not able to join, and she was supposed to join us online, but please understand that she has some urgent business for the last 2 years. And during the COVID-19, we had lots of international conferences in South Korea. And as you know, there are many international guests who are joining us online, but sometimes there can be some technical issues, or sometimes they cannot join us online because of the many urgent matters. And it can be some technical issues or the time gap issue. And I believe sometimes this happens. So please understand that. So that underlines that we should be connected face to face. Even though we're traveling afar, we should stay together. And physically, when we are together, we can have a better interaction, as you know. So we need to see each other. Physically, when we are together, there can be better interaction. Sometimes it can be more convenient. So once again, there is a clear message. Once we are physically together, despite the technical difference, technical advances, those technical advances cannot beat the human interaction, I mean the physical interaction. Let me begin the discussion and the debate session. I'd like to introduce the panel discussants for today. I will briefly introduce them, and for the details, the panelists themselves can talk about themselves. So panelists can introduce themselves. And first, we have Professor Heemoon from the Hankuk University of the Foreign Studies. Also, he is leading the Latin American Institute for the research. And as far as I know, he graduated university in Brazil, and probably he can talk about where he studied, because he knows about himself best. And now we have Dr. Han Sang-hoon from KEI, and he has been studying a lot about the environmental studies, and he has published lots of the books, and he has been the president for the Society of the Environmental Studies. I will give you some time to introduce yourself before we start the panel discussion, please. Yes, is it working? Yes, thank you. And Professor Park, Professor Peter Burdon, thank you very much. And I read the transcript from the Muta Ito. I read her transcript, and I thought that I'm getting back to my law school days. What is the definition of the law? What is the commonality among those three people? When we try to understand the law, what matters is wisdom and or the status. And the status is also related to your rights and authority. So from the legal philosophical way, whether it is rights oriented or is the obligation oriented. But as you know, as Mr. Peter Burdon talked about the obligation-centric approach, I fully agree with what you say. And also, Ito, who is not here today, talked about the nature's rights. And that's a new interpretation, that's a new approach. I believe that is really meaningful and that's necessary. And Professor Park also talked about some of the new litigations. A single person can sue against the corporation, and probably the corporations should take more responsibility about climate changes. And those who were born in the 1960s, who emit the biggest amount of CO2, I feel sorry about the young babies who were born in the 2010 and 2020. And that was a really stark message. I consumed 6 times more of the carbon. Do I have the rights to do it? And maybe I have the rights not to use that much of the carbon. So that was a clear message to me. I was listening to you and I read one manuscript. So, again, well, the law should do some action. There is a climate crisis. And what is the role that this legal system and the law can play? And as you know, in the modern society, the starting point is about capitalism. The free capitalism was granted because of the legal system. That was the starting point of the modern legal system. That's what I learned. The starting point of the legal system was well before that. The imperialism, they do not regard the citizens as human beings, and they simply talk about the legal status. In the past, people were regarded as object. People on the lower class was more like an object. And you can be like a noble class. We are going to give you some freedom. And that is the foundation of the modern legal system. So now, in this legal system, and in the past, we were obsessed about the right rather than the obligation. And people talk about the human rights. And in the German legal system and the German law, many people talk about the freedom and basic human rights. That was dominant process and the dominant trend. The environmental rights might not be regarded as a human right or the basic rights in the German legal system because the legal system is conservative. It should be accurate. That's the belief. And that was a kind of the trap. And because of that, even though everybody should be able to enjoy the freedom, and there is a certain line or the certain limitation of the freedom. And we forgot about that for the last 30 to 40 years. Even without the legal code, there is a moral obligation. We are at the center of the universe. We are living in this earth. And as a creation of life, and we are a part of the universal system. And we should not go against that kind of universal system. If we are enjoying that freedom, that kind of freedom is too much, and that should be punished. And if the legal system does not punish you in that way, the nature will punish you. That is why people talk about the climate apocalypse. I have a hope, though, because probably the legal system can be the tool still, because whoever the president may be, and if he or she is against the law, he or she will not be accepted by the citizens. There are norms, regulations, social understanding, but what needs to be codified? And that needs to be codified. That kind of principle that can be applicable to everyone, that can be based on the law. So, you talk about the sorceress and the apprentice. Let's say they are not equal to all the humankind. Of course, we are just like that, but as Professor Peter Burdon said, and those who are going beyond the limitation, we need to pinpoint who is going beyond the limitation, and that they are the ones and they are the problematic ones, and they can be 100 major companies, maybe. So, it is really certain what kind of legal system should we have and what kind of limitation should we draw. And there should be clear red line that should not be crossed. If we have the legal system, people will follow anyway. And we are making lots of effort to create that kind of a legal system. But we are running out of time. And according to the IPCC report, actually, the threshold is already here. 2022. The threshold is already here. So, my key message is this. To guarantee human rights, the freedom has been granted in a maximum way, maximum guarantee of the freedom. However, the very foundation of your freedom is the earth. So we need to have some adjustment. And in that sense, if the legal system is not working, then probably, as Professor Park said, individuals should work on it. They need to raise more litigations. They should have more litigations. Yes, let's do it. That kind of a threat can be working. That threat can deliver the clear warning that the Korean people have the consensus. This is the red line you should not cross. And that kind of message should be delivered And we've been building that kind of the codes, but that should be built in the future. So, once again, the guarantee for the freedom has a certain legal boundary. But again, if we are going beyond that boundary, that can be a threat to our very existence. And once again, we are living together. If there is anyone that we are living together, if there is the one who is going against that kind of concept that we are living together, and they should be removed from our earth community. And then, what can be the concrete action we should take? But I have been pondering about the concrete action that we should take. And I've been studying on the ecological justice for the last 3 years. The international discourse about the ecological justice should be turned into a local code and local act so that any person who belongs to the country can abide by that kind of ecological justice. And if you are complying with the ecological justice, which has been codified, then you can survive and you can be sustainable. Then what can be the justice? That should be turned into local regulation and local act. We talked about COP, IPCC, but they are not that effective, to be honest. Many people are disappointed. Actually, it is beyond disappointment. Many people are now discouraged and totally disappointed about that kind of system. So we need a drastic new change. Starting from Korea, the ecological justice should be put into policy and the legal framework, and on a systematic way, we need to work step by step. And there must be a kind of climate solution that we can devise. And who is getting the benefit coming from the climate crisis? There must be someone who is getting damage coming from the climate crisis. We should ask for the responsibility. There are someone who is getting the benefit, who is getting the damage. Then it is high time for us to define who are responsible. That kind of responsibility should be asked clearly. That is a part of ecological justice. In the process, many people talk about the carbon neutrality by 2050. In Korea, President declared net zero only when he has only 1 year in his office, only when he had 1 year remaining term. But how about those who are under the president? Why should they do it? How they can do it? Just a single statement does not work. So, what I'm telling you is to achieve the carbon neutrality, how you define the goal in the process of making the decision to set the target, many people were excluded in the decision-making process. So that kind of process is really important. Even though we talk about the green transition, we might not have social consensus. Just paying them money does not work. How about the distribution? How about the fair distribution and the conflicts? So the procedural justice is really important, even with the really good distribution and even with the good procedure and process. If we have a flourishing economy based on the fossil fuel, this issue has not been resolved fundamentally. And the productive justice, just like Marx said, needs to be considered. And another type of the justice is there are many species, many life, not just humans. The legal personality should be accepted for those living creatures. There are non-human creatures. They have the life. They have the rights. And if we do not accept or recognize that the rights, the nature's rights, the earth's rights, we should accept that. We should recognize that. If we are not doing that, the companies and the countries do not have the rights and the obligation to grant that kind of the rights. So, as Peter said, the obligation-oriented approach will be really important in recognizing the nature's right. So, that's really important. And actually, that was the suggestion from the Ito. Last but not least, as Professor Park is next to me, let me ask a question. Why Korea is benchmarking other countries? We have Samsung Electronics, #1 company in the world. And we have the POSCO. We have lots of global companies, renowned global top companies in Korea. But the situation in Korea, well, we are just looking into case studies in the Europe, case studies in the US, case studies in the Germany. But in Korea, we are not making any progress. That is something that the company owners should think about. So, for the legal practitioners, should think about it once again, and I'd like to ask Professor Park to give some more advice on it.
조희문 교수님께서 토론을 해주시겠습니다. 두 분의 토론을 다 듣고 나서요. 그 피터 벌든 교수님과
So after we are going to listen to one more comments from Professor Cho, and after hearing all, then we're going to give the microphone to Professor Burdon later. Nice to meet you. My name is Cho Heemoon, and I am from the KUFS. I teach the Latin American law because I am practicing law in Brazil. And then I practiced law in Brazil. And then I received invitation from the Korean University of Foreign Studies. I thought I was forgotten by Koreans, but thankfully I received invitation from my university. So I came back to Korea. My students are so busy. They are working hard to pass the bar test, so that they are not interested in my study. I am also working with other professors to study Latin America. My study has been focused on climate related. And now also we are studying transition toward ecological civilization. So we were making language jokes because in Korea the lyrics are similar. So we were making jokes like 생태 or 동태. We were making language jokes. We had Korean studies of the research studies in Ecuador, and that time the head of the indigenous people came out with the big hat. And then there was a person who were explaining about their culture. So we were intrigued by their explanation, and then we went to Galapagos. And while visiting Galapagos, we saw and we experienced sustainable tourism and ecological tourism. So all sustainable tourism forms should follow Galapagos. They limit the number of visitors. Airplanes are allowed. However, one vessel is allowed to come in to pick up garbage. And since they are controlling the planes, only the number of visitors, certain number of visitors are allowed. And living in that island is almost impossible. So the sea lions were lying down and looking at us. So we were part of the nature. We became complete part of the nature. And then we studied and brought some papers. And recently I came up with the ideas and we studied about the rights of nature. And that time I happened to refer to Professor Peter Burdon's work. So I was very happy to see him on the screen, the professor who I refer to. So by listening to various presenters, I was able to better learn, and also coming Friday and Saturday that there will be professors who will discuss about the international laws and about we're going to talk about how we're going to interpret the rights of the nature in terms of international law. We had Professor Burdon. His core message was about how we're going to theorize the reality. And unfortunately, we don't have Munta Ito, the lawyer. Ito, she is working to legislate, and her attempt is very refreshing. And also, Professor Park is mainly focusing on environment justice. Justice is not covering the realistic material, but we have to make a process. So this justice is more like social movement, but this movement is unfolded and it is affecting various parts of the society. Unfortunately, such movement is halted in Korea a little bit. Korea is trying to stick to the law and the principle of law. But I love the constitution. I'd like to talk about constitution in Colombia. The Constitution Court and the High Court, they are dancing a great tango. If the Constitution Court say that the Constitution never mentions about the rights of nature, but if you look at the ecological constitution, the ecological means ecology. Therefore, the nature rights are embedded. So it's a very active interpretation. And that's why that they value the rights of the nature. So that's why High Court goes in line, and then their verdict is also in line with the decision of the Constitutional Court. So their verdict is not only a couple of pages, but there is a long explanation. So normally their verdict is about 100 pages, which is about the length of a textbook. So this year, we are seeing good verdicts are coming out from Ecuador. So for courts, they are considering based on what logic I have to make the decision. So the interpretation is quite challenging. So for them to make the logic for their final verdict, it took about 10 years. So they are now sharing their ideas on the application and also the rights of nature and rights of animal. And part of the rights of nature that they are including the rights of animals. So they have articulated in detail the rights of animals and also the rights as part of the rights of nature. I received the presentation materials by Professor Peter Burdon and also Professor Park and also Ms. Ito. And while reading the script, I felt like I'm going home. Because when I go to other studies association, that it is often new, such concept or the rights of animals and rights of the nature are quite new to them. However, we are gathered here to talk about the legal personality of nature. So when we talk about the legal personality, it means that there are rights and obligations. Then let's say, what kind of obligations does my cat have? That's why we cannot pursue only rights. In the legal system, to explain that is very difficult. Maybe in our heart that yes, we agree that yes, my animal, my pet has rights. However, as an academic scholar, that I can't just argue that this cat has rights because some argue that you don't have any ground for assertion.
그런데 요 얘기가 자연의 권리라는 그 파차만마라는
Earth model
쪽으로 가잖아요.
is a direction that we're going in our discussion.
의무라는 것이
Then in this discussion,
자기네 그 문화에서는 없는 것.
rights and obligation don't exist in their
과거
teaching in their society.
말씀하시면은 옛날로 가면은
If we go to the ancient times,
그것이 나오질 않거든요.
there are no discussions about rights or obligations.
그러다 보니까 이게 뭐냐면 서양의 법제가
With the Western legal system exported to the world, the legal system and the main entity is entitled to or have divided rights and obligations.
구하기 위해서 소위 얘기하는
So again, this backdrop,
생태계에서
in this Earth
권리나 의무라는 거를 논하기 전에
ecosystem,
법제화된다 그러면은 일종의 해체 모여를 해야 되는데
we have to combine these ideas together.
피터 교수님한테 제가 한번 여쭤볼게요.
I'd like to ask one question to Professor Burdon, because in your statement, you said
as a whole 하면서
we now have
responsibility in the Anthropocene means
there is a
that
section say, for me,
situate human freedom not in relation to the humans but as
for me, responsibility in the Anthropocene means that we situate human freedom not in relation to other humans, but as emerging from nature as a whole, followed by, you say,
be conjured from thin air. It awaits realization
and this is a pre-ethical position in the same sense as I discussed Quete's poem.
in a new approach 해가지고 요 new ethics라는
And also you mentioned about new ethics.
결국은 인간하고 자연의
So this new ethics are in the relationship between human and the economy. I think these are the new ethical foundations.
심증적으로는 제가 굉장히 알아요. 다른 논문에
I know from my heart and also from my experience, I know that
된 게 있으면 한번 좀
this is the new concept, but I'd like to know more about it.
인간이
And while writing my paper,
소위 얘기하는 이 먹이 사슬에서 어쩌다
in the ecosystem and also in the
것이 결국은 moral responsibility
in the whole system of animals in the food chain, that also human
전 지구 생태계
has
원인이 할 수 있는
some
거는
ethical and moral issues. So what human can do is to nurture the nature, not to disrupt the nature. So if there are negative effects caused by
인간
human beings,
뭔가가 엘리미네이트 되든지
it means some elements should be eliminated, or we need to at least have some sort of solutions.
저도 그걸 굉장히 주장하는데 일종의 스튜어드 청직이
We often mention stewardship. So stewardship accompanies obligations.
생각까지 하기 때문에
And
나름대로
since human beings
restrain morality
think power, the self-restraint moral power is required in human beings.
오늘 얘기 나온 것 중에 굉장히 큰 부분들이 기업에 관한 사항.
And today's discussion involves industry obligations as well.
별도의 인간이 기업을 만들지만
Human
legal personality를
generates businesses, however, that we have given illegal personality to corporation. In our commercial law, a person is divided into legal person and natural person.
근데 legal person 누가 만들었냐?
Then who makes legal person? There are shareholders under the legal person.
이 기업이라는 것은 결국은
In the modern era,
주인은 나는 책임을 여기까지만 지겠다고
the owner has limited power.
하는데 사실 그 기업의 역사를 보면 옛날
If you look at the history of businesses, that goes back to the Roman era.
publicani라는
Publicani
어떤 구성체를 통해 가지고
is a Roman community that, based on that, the Roman Empire
위임받아 가지고
expanded to the world. And that was the organization given power to control. And also, in this new modern era, the British companies had East Indian Company to control the colony. So if we say good company and bad company, that there is a
브라질의 반대법의 이름이 뭐냐면
story. Also, we can find good examples and the bad examples in Brazil. So there is an anti-corruption law in Brazil too. So such efforts are all taking place to sort out good companies and bad companies. And ES is also part of our efforts in pursuing our stewardship.
원칙이 사실은 파리 협정에서 굉장히 중요한
CBDR is an important part of Paris Code, Paris Agreement.
기후 변화 또는 지구 생태계에 어떠한 나쁜 영향을 미친다.
If anybody poses harm to Earth's ecology, then we all have the common obligations. However, since science technology has advanced,
그러면 당연히 우리가 인간이 더 큰 책임을 져야 되고
if humans are accused of posing harm, then of course we have to be responsible. And if businesses are posing more harm, then the businesses have to be more responsible. So if advanced countries pose more harm, then advanced countries have to be responsible.
지금 이제 마무리 부탁이라니까 제가 딱 1분만 해가지고
Okay, since I'm asked to close my comments, okay, I'll comment only one last comment. I'd like to ask Professor Park.
에서는 지금
In Latin America, in Constitution in the 1990s, there was Constitution revision. There are two distinctive revisions in the basic rights. The basic right is individual rights. And the third generation rights involve environmental and housing and clean air rights, also the Consumer Act. So they are part of collective rights. So in the Constitution, these rights were stipulated as individual and collective rights.
그것이 뭐냐면 헌법 소송들을 많이 만들어 놨어요.
So there are related litigations followed.
우리나라의 경우에도 이제 그 헌법 아마 개정 논의가
Also in Korea, there are suggestions for constitution revisions. So in relation to constitution revision, I wonder if Professor Park had some ideas in terms of nature rights. If you have to pick one, then what would you like to add to constitution revision?
네, 두 분 토론을 마치셨는데요. 지금 시간이 다 되어 가긴 합니다만 혹시
Thank you very much, as time is running out, but I want to ask if there's any question from the floor.
그러면 시간에 제한이 있어서
So, as we have time limitation,
지금 피터 벌든 교수님
I would like to ask Professor Park and Peter Burdon to respond to the discussion. You have 2 to 3 minutes, and you can make a comment, 2 or 3 minutes.
그러면 먼저 피터 벌든 교수님께서
First, Professor Peter Burdon, now the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for those really intelligent and engaging comments. I really appreciated it. I think I've got just 3 comments I'd like to make in response to perhaps first Professor Park's speech, which I really enjoyed. And I think for me, the thing that stood out the most and which I'll keep thinking about is the really important point you underscored about how developed attribution science has become. Perhaps 10 years ago, people wouldn't have brought cases before courts because they were worried that it wasn't going to be successful. Really important how you underlined how clear attribution science is now, to the point where we can pinpoint regions and areas responsible for things like climate change. And it will be of no surprise to people there in the room that, of course, Australia and its insistence on digging up coal bears large responsibility, certainly a responsibility greater than its population. Sunghan, I really appreciated your comments about regional approaches to this, and it reminded me of a comment that my friend Ron Engel made. Ron was one of the drafters of the Earth Charter, and of course the Earth Charter contains a lot of the language that we've been discussing, the language of rights and obligations and stewardship. After it was passed and became a civil society document, one of Ron's main objectives was to then take it to local communities so that it could be interpreted and enforced in a way that made sense to local people. And Ron proposed that in the early 2000s, and he was told, don't be ridiculous, we don't have enough time. And 20 years have passed since that was said. I think we have to make time for those kinds of approaches. And I really appreciated the way you were able to articulate that. Heemoon Jo, fascinating reflections on Latin America. I'd be very interested to know your thoughts around the effectiveness of rights of nature in that region. Certainly when I've visited Ecuador, one of the things that I've been struck by, and perhaps this will come up in the next part of the conference, is it's very difficult to make rights of nature have meaning when a large portion of your economy depends upon extracting fossil fuels. And so when I see rights of nature in Ecuador actually tackling massive multinational oil companies, making them change their behavior, then I'll perhaps think it's got stronger, more power than it currently does. And just very, very quickly, I know we're out of time, but I think the comment, your question around ethics, I think we just need to give up that the modern idea that human freedom derives from our relationship to other humans. If those ideas mean anything today, it's only because they can only be grounded in our relationship to the Earth and the Earth system as a whole. And I mean, that's something that Mary Evelyn Tucker would write about, Thomas Berry would write about, and really I'm just following that line of thought. But thank you again for having me. It's been a real privilege to be part of this, even virtually.
네, 감사합니다. 이어서 박시원 교수님께서
Thank you, Professor Park. And there were two questions posed to me. Dr. Han asked me why we are only benchmarking the cases, why Koreans cannot make original cases. That was accurate. Let me put it this way. Actually, as Dr. Han, as you mentioned, in the 1960s, we have the biggest carbon budget. In the past, nobody talked about this. That's why we do not have the original case, because those who were born in the 60s did not talk about it. And now there are many youngsters who feel that this is a tangible and significant issue for them. Just about a month ago, I made this presentation to the lawyers and the attorneys of the Korean Society of the Attorneys. And there were many young people who were interested in topic, even though they were not practicing the law. So when you have talented resources, there will be changes. Just like in the 1980s, when we have the democratic movement in Korea, university was the starting point. Just like that, we have the famous writers coming from the university. And now we have talented resources. They go to medical school, and we have a brighter future in the bio industry. But what I'm saying is, there are many youngsters who believe this is unfair, this is their issue, and they want changes. There are many people who believe so. So the constitutional petition started from the youth of South Korea. And that has not been decided by the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court now have the German case. So they are pending on their decision. And there were 3 more similar cases coming in. For example, the rights for the children, youth, fetus, and embryo. And also there is another litigation for the unconstitutionality about the Carbon Neutrality Act in South Korea. So I would say the Constitutional Court will make a ruling, and I expect there will be more and more original cases in South Korea. And the second question is about the Latin America and constitutional revision in Latin America and South Korea's constitutional revision. Well, my comment is, in the Moon Jae-in administration, many people had a big aspiration about the constitutional changes, especially those studying environmental acts and the laws came up with various versions of the update. They talked about the environmental rights, climate rights, non-human rights, and the animals' rights. But we were not able to change the constitution. Now we have the new administration in South Korea. Well, for those interested, should raise the issue. Once we can create a way, then we may have some constitutional changes and modifications. And as you know, many revision candidates have been proposed already. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the 2 presenters and the 2 panelists. And also, Mumta Ito shared her manuscript, and we covered fully about 2 presentations and 1 manuscript. The 2 panelists gave us really productive comments, and I believe that was really meaningful. Thank you very much for joining us.
Professor Peter Burdon, thank you for staying with us. Thank you. 감사합니다.